Hello and welcome to more history stuff. So this is the latest in my series on the life and career of Gruffudd ap Gwenwynwyn, Lord of Southern Powys and Mid Wales in the 13th century. The last time we saw him in the previous video, he was fleeing into England, having taken part in what looks to be a failed assassination attempt on Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the Prince of Wales and Gruffudd's former overlord. In 1274, Gruffudd chose to break with Llywelyn after almost a decade as his vassal, takes part in this failed conspiracy, and then along with his co-conspirator, Llywelyn's brother Dafydd, is forced to flee into England to escape Llywelyn's vengeance and take shelter at the English court in London. And this more or less coincides with the return of Edward, the new King of England, Edward I, from a 5-year absence in the Holy Land on crusade, and then sorting out his affairs in France. And Edward comes back to find this very turbulent situation in Wales and the Welsh marches, in which Llywelyn, his position is under serious threat. He's under attack from the Marcher Lords. He's also under attack from other Welsh princes, notably Gruffudd and Dafydd and Gruffudd's son Owain. And the situation is threatening to escalate into an all-out war. This is prevented for a couple of years at least by the return of the king, as it were, the return of King Edward. And what happens in the next couple of years is this very tense situation in which Edward demands that Llywelyn come into England, come to London and perform the oath of homage and fealty, which Llywelyn does owe as part of the terms of the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267, which was implemented a few years earlier. Now this document, this treaty, was a bit of a double-edged sword, because while Llywelyn managed to get Edward's father, Henry III, the previous King of England, to acknowledge Llywelyn's title as Prince of Wales, and he's the only native Prince of Wales to get a King of England to acknowledge his title, and that's quite a remarkable achievement. The downside is that he has to acknowledge that the King of England and his heirs are his feudal overlords, that he is their vassal, their inferior, and his entire power and status as Prince of Wales rests on that relationship. So from the start, it's a very difficult, very potentially fractious arrangement, and so it proves. Llywelyn refuses to perform the oath, to obey Edward's summons, and one of the main reasons why he refuses is because the king has chosen to give shelter to Dafydd and Gruffudd, who Llywelyn accuses of being traitors and of having conspired to murder him. So you have this standoff over a period of 2 or 3 years, in which neither side is prepared to budge. Edward and Llywelyn are two very determined, very proud, stubborn individuals, and their personalities, this personality clash, is probably at the root of why there can be no resolution, because Llywelyn isn't prepared to take the step of going into England to perform this oath, and Edward isn't prepared to take the step of going into Wales to meet Llywelyn, because from their perspectives, to do so would be a loss of face, a loss of prestige, and no political figure at this time can afford to lose prestige to a rival in this sort of way, and to give ground. So something's got to give eventually. And Gruffudd, as he always does throughout his career, he takes full advantage of this increasingly tense situation. He flees into England, as I said, in 1274, but then bases himself at Shrewsbury on the Anglo-Welsh border. And from there, he and his sons launch constant raids into Llywelyn's territory. Although, as far as Gruffudd and his family are concerned, it isn't Llywelyn's territory, it's their territory, because their raids are directed mostly into the area of Southern Powys, which is actually Gruffudd's ancestral lordship. These are the lands that he's been fighting to win back and keep from the lords of Gwynedd for decades now, and he's lost them again because he's been forced to seek shelter in England, and Llywelyn and his men have occupied southern Powys again. But Gruffudd, knowing that he's got the king's support, is able to set up a headquarters at Shrewsbury and then lead these constant armed raids into Powys to attack Llywelyn's men, raid, plunder, take cattle, burn farms, villages. This is the usual sort of grinding attrition of medieval warfare, and then take their plunder back into England, back to Shrewsbury. And Llywelyn complains about this frequently to Edward, and Edward does take some steps to sort of restrain Gruffudd, or at least formally he does. He sends letters to the Sheriff of Shropshire and says, you know, try and contain this situation, and he orders the sheriff to make reparations to Llywelyn, to give him compensation for his losses. But Edward's this very sort of subtle character, and far more subtle than a lot of commentators seem to give him credit for. He's quite capable of playing a double game. So is Llywelyn, of course, and Gruffudd too, for that matter. They're all very sort of clever, devious personalities. And this goes on for, as I said, for a couple of years, and there are quite a few examples of the kind of complaints that Llywelyn was sending to London of Gruffudd's actions. I've got some examples here. For instance, in a letter of May 1275, Llywelyn complains to Edward I of Gruffudd's latest attacks, which had penetrated not just the eastern reaches of the lordship, i.e. southern Powys, but had ravaged the middle section of the Severn Valley in the middle of the borderlands, including the larger part of Cedwain on the southern bank. Cedwain is this vital area in the Middle Marches. This is where Llywelyn built his new castle, Dolforwyn, and established a town and market there, which was really the final trigger, it seems, for Gruffudd's decision to take part in the plot to kill Llywelyn and then break the treaty that had been agreed between them and flee into England. Because Dolforwyn, the new castle and market, was set up really as a rival to Gruffudd's own castle at Welshpool and the market he's got there. They're only a few miles apart, Dolforwyn and Welshpool. So really what lies at the heart of this conflict, apart from the old dynastic struggle between the two rival dynasties, is economic concerns. It's money. Things generally do come down to money and finance when you really dig down to the heart of it. And what Gruffudd is particularly concerned about, apart from his desire to have revenge on the House of Gwynedd, is his loss of revenue. He doesn't want to lose money to Llywelyn. And this is what drives his defection to the King of England, but also lies at the heart of his strategy when he's launching attacks upon Llywelyn's lands. He is deliberately attacking Llywelyn's economic base on the Middle Marches, on the borderlands. He's doing all he can to cut off the flow of revenue, to destroy Llywelyn's ability to wage war and to build castles and all the rest of it, because if Gruffudd can stop the flow of money to the Prince of Wales from his markets and towns, etc., then he won't be able to do anything. He'll be crippled. And this is the crux of medieval warfare. This is what everyone does. You can forget about battles, pitched battles, which we seem to be slightly obsessed about. Medieval warfare was all about subsistence and attrition, and you only fought a battle when you had no other option. Nobody liked fighting battles. They were too unpredictable, too wasteful, and they very rarely resolved anything. Wars continued anyway, no matter who won individual battles. So this goes on for a couple of years. Llywelyn sends further complaints to the king. For instance, he complains that the land of Arwystli, which again is in mid-Wales and will become very important later, has also been struck by Gruffudd, been raided. On no less than 6 occasions, Gruffudd and his sons are accused of riding into the land, and the Latin term used in Llywelyn's letter is sex predas, meaning 6 separate instances of plundering, of raiding expeditions, which probably means that several separate raiding parties were involved. Gruffudd is mounting quite a well-organised and widespread campaign here. And really, from his perspective, he is at war with Llywelyn. Edward isn't at this point in time. He is not formally at war with the Prince of Wales. There's a lot of discussions going on, lots of messengers passing back and forth. But as far as Gruffudd is concerned, the war has started already, and he's in the vanguard. He's sort of the main guy leading the charge against Llywelyn. And he also he makes as much profit as he can out of it. According to Llywelyn's long string of complaints, some of the plunder that Gruffudd took was taken back to the markets of Shrewsbury and Montgomery and sold there, while livestock that had been lifted from Llywelyn's lands was either sold or eaten by Gruffudd's men. So they're both selling and eating the animals that they take. So this is a gradually worsening situation, and the relations between Llywelyn and Edward also start to deteriorate, which is when things start getting really serious. And there's a great deal of diplomatic language, a large batch of surviving letters. It would take hours to sift through it all. But one of the demands that Llywelyn makes just before this situation explodes into outright war is that he agrees to swear the oath of homage and fealty to Edward, that he will come and meet the king somewhere on the borderlands. But in exchange, he wants Edward to hand over David, Gruffudd and Roger Mortimer as hostages. So what Llywelyn is demanding is, I will give you what you want. I will come and deliver the swear the oath that you've been demanding for several years now, but you've got to give me what I want, and I want these 3 characters. I want David, Gruffudd and Roger Mortimer, his cousin, Lord of Wigmore, handed over to me. And this must have been very worrying for Gruffudd and David and Mortimer to read this request when it arrives in Westminster, because if Edward agrees to this, if he agrees to hand them over to Llywelyn, well, I mean, what's the prince going to do to them? Llywelyn has been quite merciful to this point towards his enemies. He doesn't tend to kill his enemies. The worst thing he does is put them in prison. But he had tried being merciful towards Gruffudd and David, and look what he got. They tried to kill him. They tried to murder him in his bed, and then they fled and joined forces with the King of England. So if Edward hands them over, he's probably, if he's got any sense at all, he's not going to be too gentle with them. But as it turns out, Edward refuses the request anyway, because he finds this all quite insulting. He's the King of England. He's the feudal overlord. And as far as he's concerned, Llywelyn is in no position to start making demands. He's a vassal. His duty is to come and swear the oath unconditionally, and he can't sort of start treating the whole thing as a bargain, as some kind of exchange, like I'll give you what you want if you give me something. No, you just fulfill this mandatory duty, and you do what the king says. That's Edward's attitude, which is probably not an uncommon one. I mean, most kings of Europe at this time would not tolerate any sort of insubordination or any kind of demand from their vassals. It's usually a very straightforward master-servant relationship, and this is what Llywelyn objects to. So that's the situation in, we're up to the year 1276 now, and we're on the cusp of all-out war between England and Wales. And hopefully from this account I've given, you can see the key role that Gruffudd plays in all of this. He's a bit of an underrated character. He tends to pass under the radar a little bit, but he is certainly very central to the growing tensions between the two countries. So yes, I've rambled on for about 15 minutes, and I think I'll leave it there on the edge, which seems a good place to stop, on the edge of war, and hopefully speak to you again later.